Good morning from Alexandria, Virginia, on a wonderful winter day. I'm Riki Ellison. I'm the chairman and founder of the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance. We were founded in 2003. Our sole mission is to advocate and educate on the deployment and evolution of missile defense. We soundly believe that having missile defense capabilities globally with our nation and with our allies makes the world a safer place. We are excited about today. We are going to discuss the NDAA and the missile defense element in that. It was signed yesterday by the U.S. Senate and it's expected to pass the administration. There's some good things about that. We know it is a transition period where this budget was partially the previous administration, President Trump's budget, and this also a combination of our new president, President Biden's budget. We also know that the Missile Defense Review is going to be coming out, and that will shape the following budget in 2023. The budget is increased by $25 billion, but more importantly, for missile defense, we've seen a 5% increase on their NDAA budget, which is really positive. And as we look at where our nation is going with missile defense, beyond being in front of North Korea and Iran, but going into a strategic competition with China specifically and with Russia, and looking at how missile defense plays into that. And we're seeing some great initiatives from increasing, probably the biggest initiative that we see bipartisan is the movement on Guam to get the architecture up and now get the resources and the urgency of that matter. But there are other great things. There's directed energies coming on board on this as well. And there's some positiveness with this. So we want to really look at this in a very clear way. We've got some experts from the committees, and we feel that we can shed some really good light on that. And certainly we are very excited about having Coach Senator Tuberville, who has led a lot of the bipartisan effort, who has led into this transformation we think that's happening with missile defense to go beyond just a North Korea-Iran capability to shifting into our bigger collective integrated deterrent. We also are excited about the PDI, and we know Dr. Hicks is in Hawaii now, and Indo-Pacific moving that as well. So our first guest, a great friend, a board member. I think he's been in national security with the U.S. government for 30 years. I think I've known him beyond those 30 years and every year since then. But we couldn't ask for anybody better. He was the former Undersecretary of Defense for OSD policy for 2 years under the previous administration. So this is going to be a great perspective by John on his thoughts, because some of this in this budget is from his administration that he served. And it's exciting because the complexity of the policy movements here are very complex, and there's nobody better, I think, in the world that can distill it, articulate it, and understand it for us. So welcome, my friend John. The floor is yours.
Well, it's great to be with you, Riki, and it's great to see everyone. Nothing like struggling with a balky Wi-Fi connection when you're remotely located, but I think I got it up and working here. Well, again, big day yesterday with the Senate voting to pass the FY-22 or the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act and sending that bill to President Biden's desk. Every year, the annual defense policy bill is a whopper of a bill. You know, they've grown to be typically over 1,000 pages. Mark Montgomery, who's going to speak later, once gave me a signed copy, and I put it on my shelf, and it looked like War and Peace up there. But that bill authorizes, of course, $768 billion, including $740 billion for the Department of Defense. The rest is for the Department of Energy. Both the House and the Senate agreed to add $25 billion more than what President Biden had requested in the bill. The NDAA has a number of important provisions on air and missile defense that we're going to talk about today. Among the positive things in the bill is that it authorizes funding for the Missile Defense Agency, or MDA, and other missile defense spending for things like the Army's Patriot program, adding $500 million to the administration's request to bring the tally from $9.9 billion requested by the administration to $10.4 billion. I know one of our colleagues is going to talk more about the specifics of the budget, but there were a few areas where I thought the Congress showed strong support, or continuing stable support is probably a better way to put it, for the National Missile Defense Mission. The full funding requested by the administration for the next generation interceptor that is so needed to improve on our current national missile defense capabilities, that was funded, as well as a requirement to carry the system through critical design review, which is a major milestone, as you know, in the development of these systems. There's also funding for a defense of Hawaii radar. Since Hawaii is located very distant from the rest of the continental U.S., some additional sensor support significantly improves the defensive capability there. And it also, in the bill, continued the funding for the ground-based missile defense program, which is important because we're going to be waiting for some time, probably at least until 2028 at the earliest, for next generation interceptor, and most likely later. Major step in the bill for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that I know Mark Montgomery is going to talk about more, $7.6 billion for that critical initiative, which is really central to shifting our military posture to the Pacific, given our growing concerns about China and ongoing concerns about things like North Korea. But as we talk about missile defense, I think one of the major policy provisions was a requirement that the Defense Department retain an independent organization for an independent study of the roles and responsibilities for missile defense. This is a subject we've looked at Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance. We produced a report on it. The NDAA directs the DoD to enter into that agreement with the National Academy of Public Administration to look at the roles and responsibilities for missile defense. And I would just say, as we've looked at this question at NDAA, and in our report on the roles and responsibilities, there's a significant opportunity for us as a nation to do better and to focus more of MDA's resources on the development of new technologies, and for the military services to play a bigger role in maintaining, sustaining, and operating systems once they're fielded. When the MDA was founded in 2002, it was given special authorities to develop and deploy missile defenses rapidly. MDA was exempted from the lengthy requirements process, the Joint Requirements Oversight Committee, and other similar bodies, and also exempted from the DoD 5000 series of acquisition regulations. And so what happened? Well, that was done in 2002. President George W. Bush directed MDA to use those authorities to deploy an NMD system to defend the United States for the first time since the 1970s, when we briefly had the Safeguard system. And by 2004, we had a system in place that had been fielded, protecting all 50 states, plus our deployed forces and allies overseas. And that all occurred under the leadership of General Ron Kadish and MDA using these special authorities. Now, since that time, of course, successive generations of the system have been deployed, upgrades, additional sensors, additional shooters, new systems developed, whole new systems like the SM-6 developed, produced, and now in operation, all much faster than we ordinarily see at the Defense Department, with 10 to 15 year development cycles. Yet year by year, MDA's special authorities have been eroded, and it's been subjected to more and more of the oversight and the treatment that the rest of the department and the military services receive. And the predictable result is the pace of development and deployment is at a much slower pace and very similar to what we see in the military services. No longer faster, more innovative. And many of the new things, there were successive generations of new technologies birthed, conceived of, and fielded, and that slowed down. And so looking at the roles and responsibilities is something that Congress directed. It's something we've looked at. And my personal view is just the pace at which we're developing and fielding new systems to counter the rapid pace of evolution that we see in what China's fielding, what North Korea's fielding, and so on, is just too slow. And we're going to have to get back to a more nimble, less encumbered approach that keeps pace with the threat. I mean, that's the iron reality. You may think you're moving fast, but if the threat is moving faster, it's not fast enough. Another major, shifting gears, another major policy provision in the NDAA was about the defense of Guam. And this provision really points to Congress's view of the importance of Guam and seeing Guam as part of the United States. It is a United States territory, and the United States citizens live there. And Guam has taken on strategic importance, increasing strategic importance, as the United States turns its attention to the Pacific. And we're much more focused on deterring and defending against China, but also dealing with the continuing threat from North Korea. Guam's a vital strategic location. It's located about 3,300 miles west of Hawaii and about some 1,500 miles from Japan. This is a vital location. It serves as a staging ground for projecting U.S. influence and power with key naval and air bases. Guam's also a hub and portal for submarine cable and satellite communications. And you may look like a small territory, but it would play an outsized role in any kind of U.S. conflict in the Pacific, whether that was with China, North Korea, or anyone else. And that's why we need to improve the island's air and missile defenses. I think the reality is that we've just got to be able to defend these important power projection points at Andersen Air Base and with our submarine bases and naval bases in Guam. China and North Korea, by the way, both recognize the strategic importance of Guam, and we see evidence of them continuing to develop and field capabilities that are aimed at negating the ability of the United States to project power forward from Guam in a conflict. Creating a comprehensive missile defense for Guam has been a priority now for two successive Indo-PACOM commanders spanning 4 years. The Indo-PACOM commander has been clear that the threat to Guam will continue to increase and that the rapid pace of China's buildup, including its hypersonic missile capabilities, is going to continue apace for the coming years. So the NDAA directs the Secretary of Defense to identify an architecture and an acquisition approach for implementing a 360-degree integrated air and missile defense capability to defend the people, infrastructure, and territory of Guam from all advanced missile threats. And the bill is clear, both cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missile threats. The architecture has to have the capability to integrate numerous multi-domain sensors, interceptors, command and control systems, while maintaining the full kill chain performance against that spectrum of threats. The bill was noteworthy in that it called for that architecture to be submitted by the Defense Department that leverages existing systems like the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, the SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor systems, the THAAD and Patriot systems, and the integrated battle command and control system called IBCS. The bill took an unusual step of mandating a target date for initial operational capability, directing the architecture aim at 2025. That's been done by the Congress before, but not recently. When I served as a staffer, for example, in the Congress, there were attempts to mandate initial deployment dates for national missile defense, but it's been quite some time since that was really done. This report will be due 60 days to Congress after the enactment of the NDAA or when President Biden signs it. Of note, related to this, but a slightly different topic, the NDAA fully supported the funding request DoD submitted, the President submitted, that is to say, for the Space Development Agency and Missile Defense Agency for the space sensors that are necessary for the defense of Guam over the next 10 years and beyond, specifically the HBTSS that's critical for hypersonic defense. And so, I think broadly speaking, again, the Congress seeing missile defense as an important mission, increasing the funding over the president's request, and supporting some of the key initiatives, particularly things like the defense of Guam, where clearly the Congress felt the administration was not moving rapidly enough, and putting a strong message forward about there needs to be some looks at more efficiency and can we be better at the way we structure the roles and responsibilities for this important mission. So let me just turn it back to Riki now and say I look forward to the question and answer period and hearing from the other panelists. Thank you, Riki.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think what you're seeing is that urgency, the urgency and the demand of the United States Congress to get this thing moving in Guam, to move that process with integrated air missile defense against a bigger threat than North Korea than we're seeing. I'm real excited about this one. We have a younger generation here and an organization that I respect tremendously. The Heritage Foundation has been the leader for missile defense in the world, and we can go all the way back to the 1999 Missile Defense Act, which they went out, and I was a young kid then, and we went out and got, I think, 12 state resolutions to get all 50 states having a missile defense system, which ended up in Alaska. So they have been the bedrock. They were the foundation that went forward to get us deployed, supported the President 43 initiative to do that. We have with us Patty Jane Geller, and Patty Jane has been in the Senate Armed Services Committee this past year. And she's worked the missile defense issue. She's worked the nuclear posture issue there. She's also was big in putting forward Space Force and legislation in there. So we've got a great opportunity to hear her perspective and her thoughts on the NDAA. Patty Jane?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Riki, for the nice introduction. It's cool to be here with you in person, a lot easier than dealing with Wi-Fi issues, and also to speak with our other esteemed panelists here. So what I thought I would do is kind of dive deeper into the NDAA, look at the numbers, and in particular go over how the NDAA does and does not strengthen our position in the competition with Russia and China. So we know that the missile threat is growing. Both Russia and China are deploying different types of hypersonic weapons. Russia threatening just the other day to add more nuclear capable missiles to Europe, and China strengthening its missile arsenal in the Indo-Pacific that's capable of striking U.S. forward deployed forces and even territory in the region. And missile defense is critical for great power competition with Russia and China because it can convince an adversary that its attack will fail, or help convince an adversary that the cost of having to overcome U.S. missile defense is not worth the benefits of success. So I'm going to go over a few things. First thing I want to build on a bit is on the defense of Guam, which Secretary Rood covered, but I want to dig into some of the numbers, a bit of a different perspective. So we heard from Secretary Rood the strategic importance, the location of Guam, and how there are thousands of U.S. citizens on Guam, and so it's important that we work to defend it. And Indo-PACOM has made it very clear that we need an advanced missile defense capability on the island. That has been on its unfunded priorities list for the last 3 years. But despite all of this, up until this year, we haven't actually taken action on the defense of Guam. Instead, for the last few years, we've just been studying the problem. Meanwhile, of course, China's not stopping its buildup to let us study. So I was glad that this year's budget finally included funding for missile defense of Guam, but we only saw about $118 million requested, which is less than half of the $350 million that Indo-PACOM had identified in its 1251 report for Guam submitted earlier this year. So in the NDAA, Congress added $100 million to Guam defense, which is great. We know that Congress has been an advocate of missile defense of Guam and has been pushing the Missile Defense Agency to figure out the architecture it wants to deploy. But that plus up still leaves us over $100 million short of what Indo-PACOM wanted, and it's also kind of surprisingly less than what the HASC and SASC had initially plussed up in their original NDAA bills. So I'm not sure if I'm missing something there, or why we didn't get the rest of the funding. But I think bottom line is that if we want to be serious about the China threat and the potential timeline identified for a Taiwan invasion, we need to act with urgency now and in the future with getting this system up on Guam. So aside from Guam, there is a lot of good news in this year's NDAA, with Congress supportive and adding plus-ups to a number of key programs for missile defense. First, I'll touch on sensing. Secretary Rood mentioned that we got full funding for the hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor, the HBTSS, which would deploy a constellation of sensing satellites in low Earth orbit in order to detect and track all types of missiles throughout the entirety of our flights. We know that this is critical for sensing hypersonic missiles, which don't fly directly in view of our current sensors and radars. And being able to detect and track missiles throughout the entirety of their flight is so important, not only because being able to track a missile is a prerequisite for intercept, but because it's necessary for deterrence. For instance, even if we can't intercept a hypersonic missile, we can be able to organize a retaliatory response to deter the threat. But we need to be able to track the missile and see where it's going in order to do that. To talk about interceptors for a bit, Congress gave a bunch of funding additions or plus-ups to a number of programs compared to what was in the budget. There were additional procurement dollars for SM-3 Block 2A interceptors, as well as THAAD, a couple more THAAD interceptors. There was a plus-up for hypersonic defense to work on an interceptor that can address hypersonic missiles in their glide phase instead of their terminal phase. And the big plus-up, I think, is showing us not only the importance that Congress attributes to hypersonic defense, but how maybe we're behind and we need to keep moving quicker. And finally, there's a bunch of money added for directed energy, in addition to a provision that would give NDAA authority over directed energy and with instruction to prioritize this research. That's something that was significant to me because I think General Hyten was the one to say that directed energy could help us address cruise and ballistic missiles in a potentially more cost-effective way than ground-based interceptors. And I look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific in particular, where it seems that China is exercising a bit of an offset strategy to overwhelm our ships and assets in the regions with its large missile arsenal. It may be a competitive strategy to get us to spend more and more money on missile defense. So that's why I think investing in directed energy and other advanced technologies is so important to strengthen our position in the spending race as well. So if you'll notice, kind of the theme of what I've been talking about in the last few minutes is that Congress has been adding a bunch of funding plus-ups to the original budget request in the NDAA. And that's great. We're thankful to Congress for doing this. But this is also highlighting more of an underlying problem here, and that's with the NDAA budget, the Missile Defense Agency budget that we saw this year and in previous years. We hear the current and previous administrations talking about the increasingly complex missile threat that we're facing. But this year's NDAA budget, about $9 billion or so, is actually the lowest that it's been since 2016, and the same number that it was in 2004, believe it or not, when obviously the threats weren't what they were today. So as another example, I think someone mentioned the Homeland Defense Radar for Hawaii hasn't been in the budget for the last few years, and Congress is finding money elsewhere to add to it. And really what we're seeing, not just this year, but previous years, is Congress kind of piling on plus-ups that they have to go dig around for in order to appropriately fund key missile defense programs. And so I think that this approach is not only unsustainable, but is not helpful in the great power competition with Russia and China. I think we need a clear strategy for missile defense, one that's reflected in our budgets and then our future NDAA spending. And good news, you mentioned in the beginning, we have a missile defense review coming out in a month or so. So I'm hopeful that we'll see a strategy out of that that'll start to resolve some of these questions that we have. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Patty Jan was well done, very impressive. Thank you very much for that. Our next guest, our fellow board member, Mark Montgomery. I know we've talked about Mark a little bit, but I do want to mention that he was the policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under Senator John McCain for, I think, 2 years. And also for people that don't know Mark, he did graduate from University of Pennsylvania and Oxford University in England, as well as the U.S. Navy's nuclear power training program. So I just want to leave you with that. Mark, you can step in, please.
Hey, thanks, Riki. Great to listen to John and Patty Jane. Look, I'll pick up on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, and you kind of got to step back for a second and say, why did what's PACOM trying to do? And PACOM's assessment, Indo-PACOM's assessment, is that the greatest risk to the future United States security in the Pacific is the erosion of our conventional deterrence, and that without that valid and convincing conventional deterrence, China's really been emboldened to take action in the region and to supplant U.S. interests throughout the First Island chain. So Indo-PACOM's focus when they originally responded to the Senate ask on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative was to ensure they had access, maneuver, and fires. So when you look at the PDI that they submitted, and I'll tell you, this is where when the Congress's PDI is the third kind of attempt at this. The first one was Indo-PACOM at the beginning of the year. They very clearly talked about $4.7 billion in funding to get a joint force lethality, force design and posture, strengthening allies and partners, exercises and experimentation, and logistics and security enablers. I'll just break down one of them, and John and Patty Jane have hit on these. If you just take joint lethality, it's about the Guam defense system, space-based persistent radar, ground-based long-range fires, and the tactical over-the-horizon radar in Palau. These are all very specific Pacific requests, and as a result, the PACOM submission was about 50% things the services were going to do. They're 25 billion when they looked over 5 years, or 27 billion looking over 5 years. It's about 50% services were already going to do, and just bidding them under the PACOM Deterrence Initiative, but 50% new initiatives. And that kind of frustrated me that it wasn't 100% new, but I get it. You got to build on something. But that would be the high water mark, because the next one that came out was the Department of Defense came out with one that was 100% stuff they're already doing, and it was ludicrous. They said, we're putting a destroyer, an Arleigh Burke, the procurement of a DDG, the procurement of an oiler, the procurement of F-35s. That was about 4.5 billion of their 5 billion that they claimed was a PDI. It was embarrassing. I think the Secretary of Defense was embarrassed trying to defend it at the Armed Services Committee, and kind of waved it off and said, I'll get back to you, which a general acknowledgement that they had not done a good job, and they didn't. That's not bidding things that you were gonna buy that might possibly use. I mean, might as well just say, like, I'm gonna bid the TDY cost of the SecDef going to Singapore. Well, there's a PACOM, and something you were gonna do, and you're gonna just put as part of the bill. So they've stopped talking about that, which reflects well on DoD recognizing wrong. The third one that's come out is kind of the warm porridge in between. That's Congress. This 7.1 billion, I'd say it's about 80% things the department was already doing. Kind of the most egregious is they list 4.1 billion worth of steaming hours and flying hours. That's the steaming hours and flying hours that are conducted west of the international date line. That's, we were going to do that, right? We weren't going to have our pilots lose their proficiency or our seamen lose their ship handling skills and do. The choice wasn't do nothing or spend money on PDI here. It was, we were going to spend 4.1 billion. Now, I think the Senate's idea and the House's idea here is we're going to set a baseline that they'll work off of, but still, to claim this as PDI is a little rich. Another 1.5 billion is MILCON that's been planned for 3 to 5 years as stuff that was happening already. I appreciate that it's better. It's hard to break it down. I'm hoping it's deployable airbase sets for the Air Force, the kind of sets that you can put around Japan, the Philippines, Australia, maybe anchor them in Guam, so that you can rapidly move Air Force squadrons around in a crisis or contingency. And certainly there's some money, there's a little bit more money as was mentioned earlier. Guam Defense System went from 100, which was at a 0, basically went from the 114 the department asked for to 224 million, but of course well short of the 350 million that PACOM asked for. And just to step back for a second and say, we can do this. PDI is about Pacific specific procurement. Things that are done specifically to help the Indo-PACOM commander fight and win, and things that she or he isn't getting from the services inherently. And the EDI is a good reflection on this, the European Deterrence Initiative, which has spent about 25 billion over 6 years. They buy things like pre-PO Army equipment, Abrams tanks, thousands of tracked and wheeled vehicles that are all stored in Europe. The Army would have never bought that on their own and hey, where do we want to store these? We'll store them in Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland. That is not an intrinsic Army responsibility. So properly, DoD paid for it out of a centralized fund, Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO. And in fact, up till last year, even this year, I would say we spend more on things in EDI, true things in EDI, than we do on PDI. So despite all the lip service over the last 7 years or 9 years, the Pacific pivot, that whole time we've spent a lot more under all 3 administrations on very specific things the EUCOM commander needs to defeat Russia, which is important. But I'd say, focusing 2 or 3% of the defense budget on, or actually in this case, really we're asking to focus 1%, $7 billion, focused on things the services wouldn't have bought for the Pacific. That I don't think that's that hard an ask, but it turns out it is, because it takes leadership. So what I expect to see next year is, I hope Indo-PACOM gives us an honest assessment. They're tasked with doing about 60 days of what they need to fight and win, to deter China, and if we can't deter them, fight and win in the Indo-Pacific. And then with that answer, the DoD does their own due diligence and provides a PDI that's a lot more like EDI. In other words, making services procure things they weren't intrinsically going to do. Without OCO, that means services have to make other decisions to not buy things, or you have to grow the services budget. The DoD would have to make a decision. And then third, that would allow the Congress to do what it should be doing, which is actual oversight, not complete rethinking, which is what Congress has to do almost every year when it comes to this issue, because the department is not able to kind of think this way. So I'm kind of hoping that's where we're heading on this. Again, a mixed bag in this NDAA, because it points the way to the right answer, but kind of gives a middling warm porridge answer on the way there. Thanks, Riki.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it. Well, it's my great privilege to introduce to you a former student athlete, a former football player, a football coach of over 40 years. In fact, the 2004 Best Coach of the Year. And I do want to mention that he started his career as a defensive coordinator. So I know he is defensive oriented from the start. And what better way to integrate both offense, defense, and special teams and have our head coach, who is coaching this specific arena in missile defense and has led the charge for what we see in the NDAA, being Coach Tuberville. So it is a great honor to bring forward to you the Alabama Senator. Coach, the floor is yours, sir.
Riki, that's pretty good. You did good. Hey, thanks for everybody being on. Could we get a few introductions here? Let's see who all's on, Riki.
Sure. Mark Montgomery, the former Rear Admiral of Indo-PACOM, the J3. John Rood, the former Undersecretary for OSD Policy at the Department of Defense. And Patty Jane, who works for the Heritage Foundation as the missile defense expert in nuclear posture. Those are your three that you are with.
Good, awesome. Thank y'all for being on. It's been a big week for us. I think everybody will admit that. It's been a big week for our military, and I'm excited about the 2.7%. It ain't a lot, but it's at least it's some for a raise for our men and women who go out and do something that they probably could make a lot more money, but it is what it is, and we want to thank them all for what they've done. But it was a fight. It's been a fight for the last 4 or 5 months about what's going on up here. And of course, the Democrats, they're pushing money all other places, and they kept us in suspense until the end. But I just got a few talking points I want to just read here real quick so I don't forget anything. At the beginning of the last century, our country invented the aircraft carrier, but due to a slow moving Department of War and Congress that didn't take innovation seriously, it was the Empire of Japan that first used that technology on us. When people ask me why I'm so interested in missile defense, I think back to the hard lesson the United States learned 80 years ago at Pearl Harbor. That's why my #1 priority this year was the NDAA. And also before that, getting on the Armed Services Committee, which it's as hard a chore as anything, and working with the missile defense system, for Guam. I talked to Admiral, was it Davidson, when I first got here? The first couple of weeks, and he looked at me and said, "Coach," I said, "what do you need?" He said, "We have got to get a missile defense system in Guam. That's our first line of defense." And then we had a changeover in leadership of Admiral Aquilino, and he came in my office, and I'd be dang, he said the same thing, "Coach, we got to have something in Guam. We've got to defend Guam." And so from that day on, we started working on it, and We started asking questions of every admiral, every general, people and not just in that command, but the other commands across the globe. China is often called a near-peer competitor. They aren't near peer; they are a peer competitor now. We all I think, would agree with that. I think that they're given a little bit too much credit sometimes, but again, we've got to consider that every day we've got to fight to keep one step ahead or 2 or 3 steps ahead, not be trailing. China's number one threat, which makes the Indo-Pacific our number one concern, and the commander is our number one combatant commander. So when we went around, we asked everything we possibly could to find out as much about the system, why we needed a land-based system instead of one on a ship. There was a lot of great answers, and so at the end of the day, we did a lot of research on both to make sure that we actually needed to spend all this money in Guam itself. I didn't win a lot of friends on the NDAA we passed yesterday, but we added $500 million to the Missile Defense Agency directly. We added $195 million to the DoD's request for the defense of Guam, which also mandated a 10-year defense of Guam roadmap to be completed hopefully in the next few months. We fully funded the next generation interceptor, the NGI. Now I'll say this, and I'm gonna probably have this on down, and I'll just keep going for just a second. And at least on an interim basis, Congress has clearly delineated, is that how you pronounce that word? The roles and responsibilities of the various DoD stakeholders for space when it comes to space-based sensors in support of missile defense. I'm going to keep asking questions. I've been traveling. Last month, I took a 27,000-mile trip. I went to Hawaii and visited with all the Indo-Pacific commanders there, the people in charge. They showed us a plan of China, what they feel like China would do, what we would be our reaction. Very interesting. Spent a day in Hawaii, went to the Philippines, met with Manila with some of the leaders there. They're scared to death, obviously, about the future. I didn't realize how big Manila was, 14 million people. Thing that stood out to me was that we cannot afford not to fund our military the way that we have. We have got to continue to put money there and continue to make sure that our missile defense is strong, because that's what's going to be so important in that area. I'm going to keep pushing our military for more killing machines and less bureaucracy. I've never seen like the bureaucracy up here. And if we don't cut some of the red tape up here, we are going to fall so far behind China we can't catch up. Xi Jinping and Putin, we want them to wake up each morning and look out the window and say, is this the day the United States is coming? We have got to put fear in them. Right now, if you just talk to everybody around here, talk to commanders, talk to generals, talk to people on the ships that I've been on in the last few months, I mean, we seem to be fearing them more than them us. So we've got to change the narrative. Our republic defeated fascism, it defeated communism, and it will defeat the authoritarians in China who seek to suppress free trade and free people throughout the world. But we won't defeat the Chinese by out-bureaucrating them. We're going to have to make sure that they understand that they're our number one adversary. They need to understand that that's what we're building for, and that anything that they do, we can answer and answer very quickly. So I believe in all my heart that capitalism and freedom will always be the end. Our nation and innovators like the Patriots working for the Missile Defense Agency will be instrumental in getting there. I want to thank all of you for working, for the American people. Thank you for allowing me to be here today to talk about this, because again, it's been fun knowing that the game's over at this point. But really, this is kind of like the first quarter. We won the first quarter. Now we got to be ahead at halftime, and we got to keep rolling. So, in Huntsville, we do a lot, and everybody knows that, for missile defense. I've been to most of the defense contractors there. I've been to where we build THAAD missiles down in Troy, Alabama, the Hellfire missiles that they build down there. It's amazing what we do just in the state of Alabama. And I know a lot of other people do things for a missile defense and things across our country. I mean, that's the reason our country's so great. But I think we're starting to open people's eyes. I think what Xi Jinping is doing, starting to open people's eyes about what's really going on in the world right now. And I went and spent an afternoon with the Taiwanese president on this 27,000-mile trip, and they're scared to death. And they should be, because they took us out to see their microchip plants, and first class. And they, thing about China, now I didn't know this, but China makes chips, but they make third-rate and fourth-rate chips. They don't make the high caliber chips that they make in Taiwan. And that's the reason Taiwan is so important to them. That's the reason it's important to us. They're building an $8 billion plant in Phoenix as we speak. They showed us the construction on it. The problem they're running into is what we're running into with our manufacturing in this country. They couldn't find welders to work in Phoenix. So they had to train their welders and send them from Taiwan and making big bucks. Now this thing is going to cost 8 times more than the plant in Phoenix. So there's a plan, you probably saw too, that I think Samsung's putting a chip plant in Texas, and that's going to be very instrumental, to our country, to manufacturing, to building anything military-wise. So again, I think we're on the right track. I think more people are starting to wake up to the fact that, hey, I mean, this is serious, and we better take it serious. And just getting the extra 26 more billion above the budget of President Biden, and that came from the Democratic side as well. So they're starting to wake up. Now, you get outside that Armed Services Committee and you don't see the same thing, because they don't hear the classified hearings that we hear, or just the open hearings, really. They don't pay much attention to it, but there's nothing more important than what we're doing in missile defense and everything that we're doing. So I want to thank all of you for being on, and thank you for what you've done. And again, we'll be there for you. We're going to work hard, and hopefully when you get an opportunity to come by, I know Rick's been up here visiting, and it's good to build all these relationships, but that's how you win. You get relationships, get people on the same page. And when you do that, it gives you a chance to be successful. 1 or 2 people can't do it. It has to be a lot of people. So thanks for letting me be on, and hopefully we can all visit in the near future.
Thanks, Coach. And your leadership, bipartisan, to make Guam not expendable, make it a U.S. homeland position. So China thinks that too, because they don't think that. And some of our military wants it to be expendable. We got to make that thing home. And you said it right. You led that charge, and the urgency to put those resources behind that architecture has got to be right on this to make that happen in 25. And then the bigger picture is you're going to put SM-3 Block 2A ICBM interceptors on land in our homeland. And that's going to be a little controversial, but that is what you have to do right now to deter and to compete and to win. And you're absolutely right. This is going to take a team across the board to make this happen. It starts at Guam, and you led that charge, sir. So I thank you for that. And I think we're right on the goal line, on the 2-yard line, to get that thing resourced, to get it happening. And then the bigger fight, and I think the bigger fight with you too, is do we integrate the offense with the defense there, and a regional capability to create real deterrence, not just have defense separate. So yeah. I just want to pass that over to you as a linebacker to you, sir.
Yeah, we saw the area. We went to the area in Guam where they're going to put it, and it's got a lot of work to do, but it's the first step, and we'll just keep taking those. All right, guys, I got to go vote real quick. They're screaming at me, so thanks for your hard work. Let me know what else we can do, but we'll be working every day towards making sure we complete this thing, and plus, anything else that we need to do in the missile defense system. It's so important to our future, our kids and grandkids, and really us too, because we got a dangerous world we're living in right now. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, that was great. That was outstanding. And I just, he worked very closely with Senator Hirono. This is not a partisan position. This is a bipartisan position to go into Guam. I'd like to step back a little. There's a lot of things here to talk about, but I want to open up the discussion. I'm going to draw back to our Homeland Defense capabilities. And I know, as John mentioned, that we have a window of NGI not coming into 28. What is our risk mitigation between now and then? I just want to throw that out there. I know the Hawaii radar is coming, but that's not coming to 28. What is it? And are we capable just on that NGI to go with our 40 interceptors without doing more than that to hold up? And then the bigger question is, do we start moving this into a bigger position than just North Korea? So I'll pass that over to John first, and we go from there.
Well, that's one of the real concerns that I have, is that the Next Generation Interceptor program is meant to improve the reliability and the capability of our ground-based defense against ICBMs. But as you say, the target is to produce it by 2028. Our track record as a country of hitting that target has not been that great. So let's assume it will be later, 2029 or 2030. That's a long time from now, and that's a long time. Once you start deploying that, that doesn't mean you have a large capability either. It takes time to in place to complete the deployment of those systems. So, you're talking roughly a 10-year period. I think that our gap of vulnerability is too large in that period because the threat is going to continue to grow. We have the means to do things like an underlayer using SM-3, either land-based to protect parts of the United States or places that are distributed like Hawaii, and also to use our ship-based assets as surge assets. But we have to spend the time and effort to integrate those systems into our force, make the command and control links, and adjust our sensor architecture so that it supports those better. I was disappointed not to see that funded more in this budget. There's always a resource fight, but if you look at where we have been and the year-over-year erosion versus the threat in missiles, I just think we're not prioritizing that mission sufficiently. I was glad to see the Congress prioritize, for example, the spending for space-based sensors. I think we've got to not only do space-based sensors, but unfortunately, we have not begun the work for a space-based interceptor that we really need to deal with these kinds of threats. So I would like to see us tacking more towards that level. It will require us to move faster than we have to date. Again, I think you got to free up the Missile Defense Agency to have, limber, nimble authorities, which are unencumbered by all these various things that have been put in place to constrain their ability to move fast. And then we've got to have the right, empowered leadership there to move out and get it done. But if we don't do that, think of the alternative. The reason China, North Korea, Iran are featuring the production of new missile systems is because they see a vulnerability there. They're not investing the same funds in other areas. So for those that say, would it really matter? Yes, it would. And these other countries are investing very heavily in their own missile defense capabilities. It's not just that they're pursuing offenses. They too are trying to catch up to us with missile defenses. And you got to have enough to protect your core locations where you can operate from, and you have to have enough that you can maintain a defense until the offense has time to kick in and attrit your attackers and to put your attackers on their back foot. And you don't have to have an Astrodome-like 100% capability to negate everything your enemy can throw at you, but you've got to have sufficient capabilities to deal with the first phases of conflict. And unfortunately, I was disappointed we didn't invest more in some near-term offset capabilities.
Yeah.
But
I saw something in the SLEP, but for those 40 that are already in there, we got to get those things as best we can in that ability. But I also saw that the directed energy was taken away from R&E and given to MDA, which is huge. And we haven't invested in DE since the airborne laser way back, in early 2000s. But before I want to go to Mark real quick and go at the deficiency that I saw in this budget was lack of cruise missile defense. And what is that? That didn't seem to come across very strong in the NDAA. And I saw we got to look at some over horizon radars there. I don't know if it's part of Guam, but why has that not been opened up when we know our bases around the world have this weakness right now and we're not addressing it? So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on the cruise missile defense with the NDAA?
Well, I'd say two things. One, we're not addressing the immediate issue, which is the gap. You know, the Senate identified this 4 years ago, pushed them on it 3 years ago. The Army went and bought the wrong system 2 years ago, Iron Dome, and then last year admitted it was wrong. And then for just, I guess, smiles and grins, sent it to Guam to hang out for a few months in case there was a rocket or mortar attack on Guam. So, you know, we don't have a short-term defense capability of important against cruise missiles for Anderson and Misawa in the Asia Pacific, and for Mildenhall and Ramstein in Europe, and that's a serious issue. I mean, you could, in theory, align all your Patriot missiles to do this. You'd run out of you'd have a very expensive system that is suboptimal, that would not be able to do its ballistic missile defense as well while it's doing it. And there's not near enough to put around our airfields. You really need, we know we need a short, a short or medium range air defense system. And the Army is struggling to get a system called IFPC into production. And that's the, I mean, we're now at the point where the Army's, procrastinated so long that realistically, we need IFPC to succeed. And that's a bad bet. I just think in general, betting on a system that's 7 or 8 years late already, several, has got over budget year over year, and has lost the confidence at times of Army leadership and the Congress. We're now betting on it to deliver, and maybe it will, but that's still 3-4 years away, and for really being thick in the force, maybe a decade away. So we do have a hole in our swing here on those cruise missiles. If you're in the Navy, you feel a little better, just get out to sea, and then you have some defense capabilities, but don't leave your ships in port, because you don't. And if I was the Air Force, I'd be very concerned. My air bases are unprotected. So when you ask, how did we get to this? We got here because a service is not meeting its roles and responsibilities. And so we need to take a look at this as a roles and responsibilities study that's called for. As you know, MDAA is looking at this. What's the way forward on cruise missile defense? Do you continue to invest in the Army, restoring itself? And look, the Army did do this very well. In the 1980s, there were 20 plus batteries of Hawk and IHawk, and there were Rapier systems of other countries stationed all over Western Europe. We know how to do, the Army knows how to do this. They've just they've lost their, they got this hole in their swing now. Or do we turn to other services to defend themselves? Or do you turn to a third party like MDA to do it? Don't want to pre-guess the final solution here, but that's something we have to worry about, think about. And it's one of the most important solutions, most important challenges facing the joint force as we go forward into 2022 in the FY-2023 budget.
I want to ask Patty Jane on the surveillance persistent from space all the way down. I know we didn't mention the E7s, but the overall in that budget to start looking at what those capabilities are, integrating the sensor capabilities. You saw the over the horizon aspect of it. But that's also, and you mentioned very well in HBTSS, where do you think we stand and how do we go forward with bringing that forward in a more aggressive position?
Yeah, I think this NDAA puts us in a good place. I talked about funding for the HBTSS. Secretary Rood talked about full funding for the Space Development Agency as well. And, we kind of talked about the importance of putting a full tracking layer up into space to be able to detect any missile throughout the entirety of its flight, and the importance of that for deterrence. I think there's a lot we can do with it. I think HBTSS will be able to link those sensors, I think, to our shooters and kind of increase the accuracy of intercept eventually as well. So I think that Congress and the department do understand the importance of space, and we're moving out there on that.
All right. Can we go back into Guam and the urgency of that? What is left to make sure this happens? Is it that study? And once that study's done, are we full go? Are the resources matching that study? And is there language to force this to happen quickly and not be delayed anymore.
Maybe I'll start, and Mark obviously will have a lot to say, which is it's a step the Congress took to direct not only a study and to describe the constituent parts, but also I think the key thing was specifying an IOC by 2025. So that if you want to achieve that, that forces you to use more of the current systems than some new, greenfield type activity. But while that's this important step that the Congress took, it just mandates a report. Number one, departments, no matter the administration, are notoriously late on these reports. Secondly, it just specifies what their opinion is, and we'll see how strong the report is once it's done. But the Congress then will have to, fund those activities in future years for them to happen. And it's really about, at what point does the Defense Department leadership embrace this as a key mission and make the trade-offs necessary because you're going to have to do something less elsewhere in order to do more here. But given the importance of Guam and what challenge we're up against, I think you can make that case. And this is just the tough decision making that goes on resource trades. And I do think there is some inter-service rivalry again at play that happens, but you're going to need senior leadership to come in and tamp that down. It was noteworthy to me that the Congress fenced some of the funding to the Cape, withholding 25%. That's a little bit of a message that's who they think is apparently been holding up previous responses. So a little bit of a shot across the bow there. Mark?
Yeah.
I agree completely. I'll follow up and I'll leave something for Patty Jane too. I'll tell you a couple things frustrate me on this. One, this is a time issue, right? Saying deliver by 2025 is different than being able to, and losing another year of not getting the full 350. We're really putting what we're going to have as an IOC in 2025 is a slightly improved version of what we have right now with THAAD and Patriot and probably a ship parked off the shore. But what I'm hoping is that they understand that they need to construct an Aegis ashore fairly rapidly there, and they hint at this isn't like two equals giving each other guidance. This is like a parent giving a child some instruction. Like, you'll do a study, you'll look at these 6 things, and if you don't do it on time, you'll do it within 60 days. And if you don't, we're taking away a bunch of money from people that we think are the source of the problem. That's generally how I talk to my teenager, not how you have peers talk to each other. And look, it's deserved. Guam is U.S. territory with 170,000 U.S. citizens on it, 2 critical facilities, Anderson Air Base and a submarine base. And logically, as a planner, and I was an operations planner for Indo-PACOM for 3 years, the nexus of the second island chain support to fight to the first island chain and through the first island chain. And so we're not going to give up on Guam, despite a significant cruise missile threat, and therefore we have to plan for it. And the current THAAD Patriot system was really conceived about a North Korean threat at some long time ago. This is really about China now, and a whole lot of capacity and a lot of cruise missile capability that can come land-based, bomber-based, ship-based, and submarine-based. So we're going to need to put a lot of cruise missile defense capability on that island. We're going to have high-quality radars, good ballistic missile defense capability, eventually hypersonic missile defense capability, and a lot of shooters, and a network to control that, and possibly the same network could control U.S. offensive fires going out from the second island chain, from the Marianas and maybe the Compact States, places like that. So to do all that takes investment now. We will overcome these inter-service, whether or not it's going to be based on an Aegis ashore radar, whether it's SPY-6 or SPY-7, who knows? And if IBCS is functional, the Army IBCS system, it'll be interlaid on top of it to make the Army components even more effective enabling. So in the end, we're going to end up with a good joint force system. We just need to get over it, put MDA in charge of the architecture and get it moving. And then understand that our 2025 IOC is an avert your eyes capability that hopefully in 2027 is a robust capacity, just about the time I think we need to really be worrying about China and Taiwan.
Yeah, and I've been frustrated similarly with kind of the obsession over getting this architecture reported and figuring out what we're going to do before we go do it on Guam. Because we've been studying this for the last couple of years. And if the defense of Guam is so important, if it's so urgent, why don't we go start building an agents ashore on Guam? We know that we can do that. The Senate tried to put money in the NDAA last year for SM-3 ground-based interceptors for Guam, but instead Congress said, let's keep on studying. So, if we're really serious, we would go add, start putting interceptors, sensors in there. We can do that, and then we can continue getting the architecture just right as we go along. And there was something in the NDAA about adding future interceptors that we developed to Guam. But yeah, point being, we need to get going and stop studying, get the report in, and then move out.
Talking about study, we referred to it, I think, especially you, John, this is a transition kind of budget. So we're waiting on a missile defense review. And that missile defense review right now doesn't have a head of it because we're still confirming people to do it. And that missile defense review is really going to make a decision whether we're going to outpace North Korea or we're going to move in a direction of strategic competition on missile defense. So from everybody's perspective, I'll just go around the room. What's your perspective looking out from this budget to the next? Is the next budget really the truth of where the administration is going with this? Or is it not on it? And this looks like a hopeful, I'm looking at this budget and it looks like it's going that direction. I'm just asking from your objectivity, what your thoughts are to follow on this.
Well, just briefly, I'll mention this is the first full year that the administration's been in office, and so the next budget that comes should reflect their priorities. To argue it won't, I don't think it's serious because after you've been in office for a year, you've formed an opinion about the subject, and so it'll be interesting to see where they're at. I'm hopeful that it continues the trajectory of up because you got to keep pace or exceed what the threat is doing. And we have it. We're living off the fruits of some investments that were made early on where we sprinted to get ahead of the threat in the early 2000s. And then since then, we've watched our position erode and we've let ourselves become much slower in responding and less efficient with how we're spending money. Just witness this conversation about Guam. We should be moving out for producing an architecture, and we should have done that some time ago. And if it's not perfect, it can be improved upon. But one of the tactics that people that are generally opposed to an idea do is they argue for studying it more, and you study it more and you study it more, but you never actually pursue the activity. That's easier to say than I disagree with defending Guam or something of that nature. So we've got to fight through that. But I'm hopeful that it continues that priority, and I'm not sure how you could explain. I'm hopeful that the Missile Defense Review will recognize just the proliferation of these capabilities throughout the Indo-Pacific, but also in the Middle East. It was noteworthy to me when I served as Undersecretary for Policy that when we knew that Iran was going to conduct a military strike against the United States in some way, of all their capabilities and all the areas around the Middle East where they could have done that, they chose to use missiles, ballistic missiles, and only ballistic missiles to strike the United States. And that's because they felt that's where they had the primary advantage, where we didn't have enough defenses. And they didn't choose the bases that were defended with missile defenses. They chose bases that were not defended with missile defenses. And to me, that's the clearest illustration that you don't have to have enough to negate the entire Iranian missile force, but you need enough to deter and defend against, and the same thing applies in the Pacific. And that's the capability our adversaries are featuring. We have to have a credible and capable response, and we've fallen behind.
So I'm going to go around. So the roles and responsibilities question that Congress has put in that bill, that's got to shape the MDR. I think that's done on purpose to work with the administration to say, hey, we got a problem here, and we all mentioned that on that aspect of it. Mark, you want to comment on?
So you would hope it would shape the MDR, but I'm pretty confident the MDR is going to finish before the roles and responsibilities starts. So I support your logic, Riki. I don't believe the processes are married properly to do that. And probably in roles and responsibilities, they're thinking about more than just missile defense. You know, there's other roles and responsibilities in the force, particularly with the advent of Space Force now and some changes at Cyber Command. There's some other issues that need to be addressed. So, but what I'll say is you described the perfectly logical path. And so I will go ahead and bet a good chunk of my kids 529 that doesn't happen. And I think roles and responsibilities will come second.
So, we're well into the weeds over dollars and programs of missile defense, but there's kind of a broader policy debate going on over missile defense that I wanted to touch on. We hear Russia and China claiming that our missile defenses are provoking them to build new offensive weapons. They want to talk about missile defense and arms control negotiations, and we even hear some proposals in the U.S. to agree to limits on missile defense. So I'm really hopeful that the missile defense review kind of will accept the importance of missile defense. We know that the NGI is critical for deterring, just outpacing the North Korean threat, and Congress understands that as reflected in the NDAA bill. So I'm hopeful that we'll see a missile defense review that doesn't listen to what Russia and China are saying about our missile defense and will continue the long-standing bipartisan strategy to outpace the North Korean threat at minimum. And then I do think there's a conversation to be had about the role that missile defense could play in strategic competition with Russia and China as well.
There's nobody better in the world that can answer that first question than John Rood on what she stated on Russian and Chinese thinking that this is forcing it. Go ahead, John. That's a softball out of the park for you, so go ahead and address that.
Well, thanks for that intro, Riki. I can say I've spent, dozens and dozens of hours across tables with Chinese and Russian officials on this very question. And, for example, this is not a new argument they make that your pursuit of defense is somehow provocative. But it's preposterous if you think about it. And I, having explained this to them at the table, they don't necessarily argue with you about it either. For example, when I was in Beijing in the 2000s, in 2008, they said, you have sold missile defenses to Taiwan. That threatens our security. I said, well, as I said to the officials there and the generals, a missile defense system can only be used in Taiwan to shoot down a missile after you've launched one against Taiwan from China, and you have hundreds and are now pursuing thousands. Do you honestly think that you have some fear, some credible fear that Taiwan is about to invade the mainland? I mean, this is not serious. This is simply ridiculous. And they don't take issue with that or disagree with it. I mean, it's that they might mount a credible defense of the island is the issue. But the same thing with the Russians, bleeding, frankly, about, well, you might put defenses in places like Poland or in other locations in Europe. But there again, no one has, in a credible person thinks that those in some way threaten Russia's security or that NATO is about to invade, Mother Russia or something silly like that. So, these are not serious arguments, but they are arguments more about they want the ability to threaten, they want the ability to hold those locations at risk, and they want the ability, should they choose to use force, for there to be minimum possible resistance. And again, this isn't something that you spend a lot of time with them credibly arguing the alternative. They don't disagree that you're providing defenses to others that could mount a credible defense, whether it's in Ukraine or what China's posturing to do in Taiwan. They want the ability to appear menacing and threatening with little resistance.
Thanks, John. Is there anything to follow up on that? Well, from another perspective, we did the policy NDAA. What do you think the appropriate, is there going to be some variances, you think, with the appropriators matching these policies? Or we never see that the same. So I'm just want to spin it around a little bit and say, are the appropriators going to back what the authorizers have just done?
The appropriators will have their own views, and they always do. you know, it's moved on, but, you know, as an example, in my time serving as a staffer in the Senate, nobody was using pencils anymore, but the appropriators, it was kind of a fun thing. Quite a few of them would carry around pencils in their suit pockets to make the point that whatever number I write down for you, I can just erase later and write down a new number. It's sort of a, you know, a badge of honor by carrying around a number 2 pencil in your pocket. And so I think they will be influenced by the authorized numbers, but not, it won't be deterministic. But I think as much as the appropriators point out they're independent, they don't want to see a lot of extra headroom in the authorization bill. And there, I'm sure, have been conversations between the different committees to try to avoid that situation that you've got sort of empty or hollow authorized budget space. So I don't think it'll depart radically, but I wouldn't expect to see it track exactly like what you see in the authorization bill.
Honestly, I just hope the appropriators get the chance to appropriate and that we don't extend the CR even further.
Yeah, and those CRs, it's hard to for folks to understand why a delay is so damaging, but it is incredibly damaging, and it reduces our purchasing power enormously. If I were to take a back of the envelope wag guess at it, I'd say probably takes away a quarter of our purchasing power simply by not getting our act together as a country and appropriating funds on time. Because what you do in a continuing resolution is you issue thousands, and I mean literally thousands of instructions to programs and contractors and different elements in the department not to spend additional money. You delay the arrival of the money typically until several months into the fiscal year. They then rush, after spending lots of extra time administering for this freeze, to expend the money, and then they expend it inefficiently at the tail end of the year. And with all of that waste and time lost, you have real losses in the amount of purchasing power, which you really get for your money. And so the 1 year recently where we passed the appropriations bill before the end of the fiscal year, it made an enormous difference, So that's what I'd love to see us get back to.
I'll jump in on that. And Riki, I have to leave after this, but I'll say I agree completely with what John said. But what I'd say is what has to happen if we do that, a CR for the year this February, we've already experienced the CR pain for 6 months. But on top of it, we have to make sure that when there's a list of anomalies, the Guam defense system is one of them. Otherwise, there'll be no spending on it, and because of not putting it in previous bills. So it's a small amount, but you really need to get started so that you can do some of the initial work. You know, you'll lose another 6 months. And so we'll just have to stay on top of them and highlight the need, if we do head into a year-long CR, that among the many, many anomalies that occur, to get some program started. One of them is the Guam Defense System one as needed.
Mark, we're going to wrap up now, so why don't you do a closing perspective of what this was about, and certainly the NDAA from your perspective after our discussions here to wrap.
Sure. Well, it's great to hear everybody else's opinions, John and Patty Jane, and certainly Coach or Senator Tuberville. You know, this is a serious issue, and the delays going on in this, the only beneficiary of the trepidation and procrastination is China, and they know that. They study our bill, our say-do mismatch more than anybody. We say a lot about missile defense. We say a lot about Guam. We do very little. We need to match the rhetoric of the Indo-PACOM commander, which is that things are getting worse. The timeline for China potentially doing something serious is getting closer, with investments that deter China, and if deterrence fails, allow U.S. force, the joint force, to defeat China. Guam Defense System and more broadly the Pacific Deterrence Initiative are critical elements of that, and so we need to end the procrastination and get moving. But thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk, Riki.
Thank you, Mark. Patty Jane.
Yeah, not much to add. This has been a great discussion. Yeah, we're all kind of highlighting the urgency with which we need to move forward. The China threat isn't going to wait for us to study and to build new missile defense. Congress is supportive, just hoping to see budgets that reflect the importance of missile defense, and as an addition, a strategy in the MDR.
John?
Just all I'd say is our enemies will not wait for us, and we've just got to get moving out here. The tide waits for no man, as the British would say. So thanks a lot, Riki, for having us all on.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. And just from my perspective, over the past 20 years, I'm seeing a departure from a Korea-driven missile defense of our country to something much bigger. This is the first time it's actually being put on paper, being funded by bipartisan and by the administration to do the actions which include the Guam defense, which include the roles and responsibility, which includes directed energy space. So you're seeing a shift, and the shift has started, and it is documented, and this will go forward. So I think we're in a good place. Obviously, we need more resources, and we need to be much more efficient with what we've got than what we are today to fight this fight. So I think it's a good story. I know there are things that are not in it, but it's pretty big, and that MDR is going to be important. Next year's budget is going to be important. Bipartisan leadership is going to be important. But the signal that the SecDef and the president writes on that line item on Guam defense, that right now sends a deterrent issue right now to China. And that's where we got to start. And it's great to hear Congress, the people, stand up and say, we want our homeland defended. We see the threat, and it needs to be defended and deterred. So thank you for a great conversation. I appreciate it. It was an honor to be with all of you. Thank you, and have a great day, and Merry Christmas. Happy holidays to all.